Hi, I'm Glenda Cedarleaf, and tonight's bedtime story was written in 1911. It's an adaptation excerpted from Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie. This classic tale is about Peter Pan, about a fairy named Tinkerbell, and children who can fly. It's also about the importance of staying close to our magic, staying close to our imagination. So I invite you to settle in, becoming comfortable in the ways that you know best. Feeling the softness of your blankets and pillow as they encircle and support you, so you can begin to relax, becoming deeper and deeper relaxed, knowing that right now there's no place you have to go, nothing that you have to do. This is your time to allow this story to fill your mind and heart as you are transported into the imaginal realm, and then eventually into a soothing night's rest. So let's begin. All children except one grow up. They soon know that they will grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2. For a week or 2 after Wendy came, it was doubtful whether they'd be able to keep her, as she was another mouth to feed. There was the same excitement over John and Michael, but both were kept, and soon you might have seen the 3 of them going in a row to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school, accompanied by their nurse. Mrs. Darling loved to have everything just so, and Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbors. So, of course, they had a nurse, but since they were poor, owing to the amount of milk the children drank, their nurse was a prim Newfoundland dog called Nana, who had belonged to no one in particular until the Darlings engaged her. She had always thought that children were important, and the Darlings had become acquainted with her in Kensington Gardens. She proved to be quite a treasure of a nurse. How thorough she was at bath time, and she was up at any moment of the night if one of her charges made the slightest cry. Of course, her kennel was in the nursery. She had a genius for knowing when a cough is a thing to have no patience with, and when it needs a stocking round the throat. It was a lesson in propriety to see her escorting the children to school and walking sedately by their side when they were well behaved, and putting them back into line if they strayed. On John's footer days, she never once forgot his sweater, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of rain. There never was a simpler, happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for next morning, repacking into their proper places the many articles that have wandered during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch her. It is quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you had picked this thing up, making discoveries sweet and not so sweet, pressing this to her cheek as if it were as nice as a kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake up in the morning, all has been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your mind, and on the top, beautifully aired, are spread out your prettier thoughts, ready for you to put on. I don't know whether you've ever seen a map of a person's mind. Doctors sometimes draw maps of other parts of you, and your own map can become intensely interesting. But catch them trying to draw a map of a child's mind, which is not only confused, but keeps going round all the time. There are zigzag lines on it, just like your temperature on a card. And these are probably roads in the island. For the Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of color here and there, coral reefs and gnomes who are mostly tailors, and caves through which a river runs, and princes with 6 elder brothers, and a hut fast going to decay, and one very small old lady with a hooked nose. It would be an easy map if that were all, but there is also the first day at school, and it's all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. Of course, Neverland's vary a good deal. For instance, both John and Michael had a lagoon with flamingos. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands, Michael in a wigwam, Wendy in a house of leaves deftly sewn together. John had no friends. Michael had friends at night. Wendy had a pet wolf forsaken by its parents. When you play at it day by day with the chairs and the tablecloth, it's not in the least alarming, but in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very nearly real. That's why there are night lights. Occasionally in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she couldn't understand. and of these quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy's began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bold letters, more than any of the other words that Mrs. Darling had been questioning Wendy. "But who is he, my pet?" "He's Peter Pan, you know, Mother." At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she just remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were odd stories about him, that when children died, he went part of the way with them, so they should not be frightened. She had believed in him at the time, but now that she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. "Besides," she said to Wendy, "he would be grown up by this time." "Oh no, he isn't grown up," Wendy assured her confidently, "and he is just my size." She meant that he was her size in both mind and body. She didn't know how she knew it, but she just knew it. Mrs. Darling consulted Mr. Darling, and he said, "Mark my words, it is just some nonsense Nana has been putting into their heads. Just the sort of idea a dog would have. Leave it alone and it will blow over." But it would not blow over, and soon the troublesome boy gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without even being troubled by them. One night, the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off. Mrs. Darling had bathed them and sung to them till one by one they had let go of her hand and slid away into the land of sleep. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now and sat down tranquilly by the fire to sew. The fire was warm and the nursery dimly lit by 3 night lights, and presently the sewing lay on Mrs. Darling's lap. Eventually her head nodded, and oh so gracefully she was asleep. Look at the 4 of them, Wendy and Michael over there, John here, and Mrs. Darling by the fire. There should have been a 4th night light, for while she slept she had a dream. She dreamt that the Neverland had come too near and that a strange boy had broken through from it. He did not alarm her, for she thought she had seen him before in the faces of many women who have no children. Perhaps he is to be found in the faces of some mothers also. But in her dream, she was Wendy and John and Michael peeping through the gap. The dream by itself would have been a trifle, but while she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open, and a boy did drop on the floor. And with this boy was a strange light, no bigger than your fist. It darted about the room like a living thing, and I think it must have been this light that wakened Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once that he was Peter Pan. He was a lovely boy, clad in skeleton leaves and the juices that ooze out of trees. But the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all of his first teeth. And then suddenly the door opened and Nana entered, returned from her evening out. She growled and sprang at the boy, who leapt lightly through the window. Mrs. Darling then screamed because she was afraid he had fallen out of the window, so she ran down the street to look for his little body. But it wasn't there. And she looked up, and in the black night she could see nothing but what she thought was a shooting star. She returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth, which proved to be the boy's shadow. As he leapt at the window, Nana had closed it quickly, too late to catch him, but his shadow had not had time to get out. Slam went the window and snapped it off. Nana had no doubt of what was the best thing to do with his shadow. She hung it out at the window, knowing that he'd be sure to come back for it. So she put it where he could get it easily without disturbing the children. Later, Mr. and Mrs. Darling left the house and made sure that the night lights by the beds of the 3 children continued to burn clearly. They were awfully nice little night lights, and one cannot help wishing they could have kept awake to see Peter. But Wendy's light blinked and gave such a yawn that the other 2 yawned also, and before they could close their mouths, all the 3 went out. There was another light in the room now, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights. And in the time we have taken to say this, it has been in all the drawers in the nursery, looking for Peter's shadow, rummaging through the wardrobe, turning every pocket inside out. It wasn't really a light. It made this light by flashing about so quickly, but when it came to rest for a second, you saw that it was a fairy, no longer than your hand, but still growing. It was a girl called Tinkerbell, exquisitely gowned in a skeleton leaf, cut low and square. A moment after the fairy's entrance, the window was blown open by the breathing of little stars. And then Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinkerbell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. "Tinkerbell," he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment, and liking it extremely. She'd never been in a jug before. "Oh, do come out of that jug and tell me, do you know where they put my shadow?" The loveliest tinkle as of golden bells answered him. It is the fairy language. Peter looked up. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Mora Angela Darling," she replied with some satisfaction. "What is your name?" "Peter Pan." She was already sure that he must be Peter, but it did seem a comparatively short name. "Is that all?" "Yes," he said rather sharply. He felt for the first time that it was a shortish name. "I'm so sorry," Wendy Mora Angela said. "It doesn't matter," Peter gulped. She asked where he lived. "Second to the right and then straight on till morning," said Peter. What a funny address. Peter had a sinking feeling. For the first time, he felt that perhaps it was a funny address. "No, it isn't," he said. "I mean," Wendy said nicely, remembering that she was now a hostess. "Is that what they put on the letters?" He wished she had not mentioned letters. "Don't get any letters," he said contemptuously. "But your mother's got letters." "Don't have a mother," he said. Not only had he no mother, but he had not the slightest desire to have one. He thought them very overrated persons. Wendy, however, felt at once that she was in the presence of a tragedy. "Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said, and got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," he said rather indignantly. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. Besides, I wasn't crying." "It's come off?" "Yes." Then Wendy saw the shadow on the door looking so draggled, and she was frightfully sorry for Peter. "How awful," she said, but she couldn't help smiling when she saw that he had been trying to stick it on with soap. How exactly like a boy. Fortunately, she knew at once what to do. "It must be sewn on," she said, just a little patronizingly. "What's sewn?" he asked. "You're dreadfully ignorant." "No, I'm not." But she was exulting in his ignorance. "I shall sew it on for you, my little man," she said, though he was as tall as herself. And she got out her housewife, sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. "I dare say it'll hurt a little," she warned him. "Oh, I shan't cry," said Peter, who was already of opinion that he had never cried in his life. And he clenched his teeth and did not cry. And soon his shadow was behaving properly, though still a little creased. "Perhaps I should have ironed it," Wendy said thoughtfully. But Peter, boy-like, was indifferent to appearances, and he was now jumping about in the wildest glee. Alas, he had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. He thought he'd attach the shadow himself. "How clever I am," he crowed rapturously. "Oh, the cleverness of me." It's humiliating to have to confess that this conceit of Peter was one of his most fascinating qualities. Wendy was shocked. "You conceit," she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. "Of course I did nothing." "Well, you did a little," Peter said carelessly, and continued to dance. "A little," she replied. "If I am no use, I can at least withdraw." And she sprang in the most dignified way into bed and covered her face with the blankets. To induce her to look up, he pretended to be going away, and when this failed, he sat on the end of the bed and tapped her gently with his foot. "Wendy," he said, "don't withdraw. I can't help crowing when I'm pleased with myself." Still, she wouldn't look up, though she was listening eagerly. "Wendy," he continued in a voice that no woman has ever yet been able to resist. "Wendy, one girl is more use than 20 boys." Now, Wendy was every inch a woman, though there were not many inches, so she peeped out of the bedclothes. "Do you really think so, Peter?" "Yes, I do." "I think it's perfectly sweet of you," she declared, "and I'll get up again." And she sat with him on the side of the bed. She also said she would give him a kiss if he liked, but Peter did not know what she meant, and he held out his hand expectantly. "Surely you know what a kiss is?" she asked, aghast. "I shall know when you give it to me," he replied stiffly, and not to hurt his feelings, she gave him a thimble. "Now," said he, "shall I give you a kiss?" And she replied with a slight primness, "If you please." She inclined her face toward him, but he merely dropped an acorn button into her hand. So she slowly returned her face to where it had been before and said nicely that she would wear his kiss on the chain around her neck. When people in our set are introduced, it's customary for them to ask each other's age. And so Wendy, who was always liked to do the correct thing, asked Peter how old he was. "I don't know," he replied uneasily, "but I am quite young." He really knew nothing about it. He had merely suspicions. But he said, "Wendy, I ran away the day I was born." Wendy was quite surprised, but interested, and she indicated it in the charming drawing room manner by a touch of her nightgown that he could sit nearer her. "It was because I heard Father and Mother," he explained in a low voice, "talking about what I was to be when I became a man." He was now extraordinarily agitated. "I don't ever want to be a man," he said with passion. "I want always to be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among the fairies." She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away. But it was really because he knew fairies. Wendy had lived such a home life that to know fairies struck her as quite delightful. She poured out questions about them, and he told her about the beginning of fairies. "You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies." And so he said good-naturedly, "There ought to be one fairy for every boy and girl." "Ought to be, isn't there?" "No." Then every time a child says, "I don't believe in fairies," there's a fairy somewhere that falls down dead. Really, he thought they had now talked enough about fairies, and it struck him that Tinker Bell was keeping very quiet. "I can't think where she's gone to," he said, rising, and he called Tink by name. Wendy's heart went flutter with a sudden thrill. "Peter," she cried, clutching him, "you don't mean to tell me that there's a fairy in this room?" "Well, she was here just now," he said a little impatiently. "You don't hear her, do you?" And they both listened. "The only sound I hear," said Wendy, "is like a tinkle of bells." "Well, that's Tink. That's the fairy language." "I think I hear her too." The sound came from the chest of drawers, and Peter made a merry face. No one could ever look quite so merry as Peter, and the loveliest of gurgles was his laugh. He had his first laugh still. "Wendy," he whispered gleefully, "I do believe I shut her up in the drawer." So he let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery, screaming with fury. "You shouldn't say such things," Peter retorted. "Of course I'm very sorry, but how could I know you were in the drawer?" Wendy was not listening to him. "Oh, Peter," she cried, "if she would only stand still and let me see her." "They hardly ever stand still," he said, "but for one moment Wendy saw the romantic figure come to rest on the cuckoo clock. "Oh, the lovely," she cried, though Tink's face was still distorted with passion. And then Wendy asked Peter, "But where do you live mostly now?" "With the lost boys." "Who are they?" "They are the children who fall out of their preambulators when the nurse is looking the other way. If they're not claimed in 7 days, they are sent far away to the Neverland to defray expenses. I'm captain." "What fun it must be." "Yes," said cunning Peter, "but we are rather lonely. You see, we have no female companionship." "Are there no other girls?" "Oh no, no girls. Girls are much too clever to fall out of their prams." This flattered Wendy immensely. "I think," she said, "it's perfectly lovely the way you talk about girls." They continued their conversation, and soon Peter admitted that he came to the nursery window not to see her, but to listen to stories. "You see, I don't know any stories. None of the lost boys know any stories." "How perfectly awful," Wendy said. "Do you know why swallows build in the caves of houses? It's to listen to the stories." "Oh, Wendy, your mother was telling you such a lovely story." "Well, what story was it?" "About the prince who couldn't find the lady who wore the glass slipper." "Peter," said Wendy excitedly, "that was Cinderella. And he found her, and they lived happily ever after." Peter was so glad that he rose from the floor where they had been sitting and hurried to the window. "Where are you going?" she cried with misgiving. "To tell the other boys." "Don't go, Peter," she entreated. "I know lots of stories." Those were her precise words, so there can be no denying that it was she who first tempted him. He came back, and there was a greedy look in his eye now which ought to have alarmed her, but did not. "Oh, the stories I could tell the boys," she cried, and then Peter gripped her and began to draw her toward the window. "Let me go," she ordered him. "Wendy, do come with me to tell the other boys." Of course, she was very pleased to be asked, but she said, "Oh dear, I can't. Think of Mummy. Besides, I can't fly." "I'll teach you." "Oh, how lovely to fly. I'll teach you how to jump on the wind's back, and then away we go." "Ooh," she exclaimed rapturously. "Wendy, Wendy, when you are sleeping in your silly bed, you might be flying about with me, saying funny things to the stars." Ooh. "And Wendy, there are mermaids. Mermaids with tails, such long tails." "Oh," cried Wendy, "to see a mermaid." He had become frightfully cunning. "Wendy," he said, "how we should all respect you." She was wriggling her body in distress. It was quite as if she were trying to remain on the nursery floor. "Wendy," he said, the sly one, "you could tuck us in at night." Ooh. "None of us has ever been tucked in at night." Oh. And her arms went out to him. "And you could darn our clothes and make pockets for us. None of us has any pockets." How could she resist? "Of course, it's awfully fascinating," she cried. "Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too?" "If you like," he said indifferently. And she ran to John and Michael and shook them. "Wake up," she cried. "Peter Pan has come, and he's to teach us to fly." John rubbed his eyes. "Then I shall get up," he said. Of course, he was on the floor already. "Hello," he said. "I am up." Michael was up by this time also, looking as sharp as a knife with 6 blades and a saw. But Peter suddenly signed silence. Their faces assumed the awful craftiness of children listening for sounds from the grown-up world. All was as still as salt. Then everything was right. No, stop, everything was wrong. Nana, who had been barking distressfully all the evening, was quiet now. It was her silence they had heard. "Out with the light, hide, quick," cried John, taking command for the only time throughout the whole adventure. And thus, when Liza entered, holding Nana, the nursery seemed quite its old self, very dark. Liza said to Nana, "Every one of the little angels are sound asleep in bed. Listen to their gentle breathing." And then she left the room. The children resumed their conversation. "I say, Peter, can you really fly?" Instead of troubling to answer him, Peter flew around the room, taking the mantelpiece on the way. "How topping," said John and Michael. "How sweet," cried Wendy. "Yes, I am sweet. Oh, I'm so sweet," said Peter, forgetting his manners again. It looked delightfully easy, and they tried it first from the floor and then from the beds, but they always went down instead of up. "I say, how do you do it?" asked John, rubbing his knee. He was quite a practical boy. "You just think lovely, wonderful thoughts," Peter explained, "and they lift you up in the air." He showed them again. Of course, Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless the fairy dust has been blown on them. Fortunately, as we have mentioned, one of his hands was messy with fairy dust, and he blew some on each of them with the most superb results. "Now just wriggle your shoulders this way," he said, "and let go." They were all on their beds, and gallant Michael let go first. He did not quite mean to let go, but he did it, and immediately he was borne across the room. "I flewed," he screamed while still in midair. John let go and met Wendy near the bathroom. "Oh, lovely! Oh, ripping! Look at me! Look at me! Look at me!" They were not nearly so elegant as Peter. They could not help kicking a little. Their heads were bobbing against the ceiling, and there was almost nothing so delicious as that. Up and down they went, and round and round. "I say," cried John, "why shouldn't we all go out?" Of course, it was to this that Peter had been luring them. Michael was ready. He wanted to see how long it took to do 1,000,000,000 miles. But Wendy hesitated. "Mermaids," said Peter again. "Ooh." It was just at this moment that Mr. and Mrs. Darling looked up at the nursery window and saw that the room was ablaze with light. And most heart-gripping sight of all, they could see in shadow on the curtain 3 little figures in night attire circling round and round. not on the floor, but in the air. Not 3 figures, 4. In a tremble, they opened the street door. Mr. Darling would have rushed upstairs, but Mrs. Darling signed to him to go softly. She even tried to make her heart go softly. Will they reach the nursery in time? If so, how delightful for them, and we shall all breathe a sigh of relief. But there will be no story. On the other hand, if they're not in time, I solemnly promise that it will all come right in the end. They would have reached the nursery in time had it not been that the little stars were watching them. Once again, the stars blew the window open, and the smallest star of all called out, "Cave, Peter!" Then Peter knew that there was not a moment to lose. "Come," he cried imperiously, and soared out at once into the night, followed by John and Michael and Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery too late. The birds were flown. Second to the right and straight on till morning. That, Peter had told Wendy, was the way to Neverland. And so great were the delights of flying that they wasted time circling around church spires or any other tall objects on the way that took their fancy. Sometimes it was dark and sometimes light. And now they were very cold and again too warm. But for now they were flying strongly, able to smoothly float through the air. It was an experience like none other, feeling that sense of weightlessness. All their cares fell away. They swam and floated through the air, up in the sky with the clouds, their bodies magically supported by the pixie dust as they continue to move forward. Eventually they caught sight of the magic shores. "There it is," said Peter calmly. "Where? Where?" "Where all the arrows are pointing." Indeed, 1,000,000 golden arrows were pointing out the island to the children, all directed by their friend, the sun, who wanted them to be sure of their way before leaving them for the night. Wendy and John and Michael stood on tiptoe in the air to get their first sight of the island. Strange to say, they all recognized it at once. And until fear fell upon them, they hailed it, not as something long dreamt of and seen at last, but as a familiar friend to whom they were returning home for the holidays. "John, there's the lagoon." "Wendy, look at the turtles burying their eggs in the sand." "I say, John, I see your flamingo with the broken leg." "Look, Michael, there's your cave." "John, what's that in the brushwood?" "It's a wolf with her whelps." "Wendy, I do believe that's your little whelp." Although Neverland had been make-believe in those early days, it was real now, and there were no night lights, and it was getting darker every moment. They had been flying apart, but they huddled close to Peter now. His careless manner had gone at last. His eyes were sparkling, and a tingle went through them every time they touched his body. They were now over the fearsome island, flying so low that sometimes a tree grazed their feet. And as they flew, it was Tinker Bell's light that could help them distinguish one another. Unfortunately, she couldn't fly so slowly as they, and so she had to go around and around them in a circle in which they moved as in a halo. Wendy quite liked it. For a moment, the circle of light was broken, and something gave Peter a loving little pinch. "Then tell her," Wendy begged, "to put on her light. She can't put it out. That's about the only thing fairies can't do. It just goes out of itself when she falls asleep, same as the stars." So in time, out went Tinker Bell's light, and when they landed in Neverland, they were all so tired. So Wendy said, "Before I put you to bed, I've just time to finish the story of Cinderella." By and by, she tucked them up in the great bed in Peter's home under the trees. But she herself slept that night in the little house, and Peter kept watch outside. The little house looked so cozy and safe in the darkness, with a bright light showing through its blinds, and the chimney smoking beautifully, and Peter standing on guard. Eventually, Peter also fell asleep. The next morning they found their way to a home under the ground. The floor grew stout mushrooms of a charming color, which were used as stools. A never tree tried hard to grow in the center of the room, but every morning they sawed the trunk through, level with the floor. By tea time, it was always about 2 feet high, and when they put a door on top of it, the whole thus becoming a table, as soon as they cleared away, they sawed off the trunk again, and thus there was more room to play. There was an enormous fireplace, which was in almost any part of the room where you cared to light it. And across this, Wendy stretched strings made of fiber from which she suspended her washing. The bed was tilted against the wall by day and let down by 6:30, when it filled nearly half the room. And all the boys except Michael slept in it, lying like sardines in a tin. There was a strict rule against turning round until one gave the signal, then all turned at once. Michael should have used it also, but Wendy would have a baby, and he was the littlest, and you know what women are like. And the short and the long of it is that he was hung up in a basket. It was rough and simple, and not unlike what baby bears would have made of an underground house in the same circumstances. But there was one recess in the wall, no larger than a bird cage, which was the private apartment of Tinker Bell. It could be shut off from the rest of the home by a tiny curtain, which Tink, who was most fastidious, always kept drawn when dressing or undressing. No woman, however large, could have a more exquisite boudoir and bedchamber combined. The couch, as she always called it, was a genuine queen mab with club legs, and she varied the bedspreads according to what fruit blossom was in season. Her mirror was a Puss in Boots, of which there are now only 3 unchipped known to the fairy dealers. The washstand was pie crust and reversible, and the carpet and rugs of the best, the early period of Marjorie and Robin. Tink was very contemptuous of the rest of the house, as indeed was perhaps inevitable, and her chamber, though beautiful, looked rather conceited. I suppose it was all especially entrancing to Wendy. Really, there were whole weeks when, except perhaps with a stocking in the evening, she was never above ground. The cooking, I can tell you, kept her nose to the pot. Their chief food was roasted breadfruit, yams, cocoa nuts, mami apples, tapa rolls, and bananas washed down with calabashes of popo. But you never exactly knew whether there would be a real meal or just a make-believe. It all depended on Peter's whim. He could eat, really eat, if it was part of a game. But he could not stodge just to feel stodgy, which is what most children like better than anything else. The next best thing being to talk about it. Make-believe was so real to him that during a meal of it, you could see him getting rounder. After they ate their meal and then went to bed, Wendy could do her sewing and darning. That was her favorite time. Then, as she expressed it, she had a breathing time for herself, and she occupied it in making new things for them and putting double pieces on the knees, for they were all most frightfully hard on their knees. When she sat down to a basket full of their stockings, every heel with a hole in it, she would fling up her arms and exclaim, "Oh dear, I am sure I sometimes think spinsters are to be envied." Her face beamed when she exclaimed this. You remember about her pet wolf? Well, it very soon discovered that she had come to the island, and it found her out, and they just ran into each other's arms. After that, it followed her about everywhere. As time wore on, did she think much about the beloved parents she had left behind her? This is a difficult question because it is quite impossible to say how time does wear on in the Neverland, where it is calculated by moons and suns, and there are ever so many more of them than on the mainland. But I'm afraid that Wendy did not really worry about her father and mother. She was absolutely confident that they would always keep the window open for her to fly back by, and this gave her complete ease of mind. What did disturb her at times was that John remembered his parents vaguely only, as people he had once known, while Michael was quite willing to believe that she was really his mother. These things scared a little, and nobly anxious to do her duty, she tried to fix the old life in her mind by setting them examination papers on it, as like as possible to the ones she used to do at school. The other boys thought this awfully interesting and insisted on joining, and they made slates for themselves and sat around the table, writing and thinking hard about the questions she had written on another slate that she passed around. They were the most ordinary questions, like, what was the color of Mother's eyes? Which was taller, father or mother? Was Mother blonde or brunette? Answer all these questions if possible. Write an essay of not less than 40 words on how I spent my last holidays. Or compare the character of father and mother. Describe Mother's laugh, Describe father's laugh. Describe mother's party dress. They were just everyday questions like these, and when you couldn't answer them, you were told to make a cross. And it was really dreadful what a number of crosses even John made. The questions were all written in the past tense. What was the color of mother's eyes, and so on. Wendy, you see, had been forgetting too. Adventures, of course, as we shall see, were of daily occurrence. But about this time, Peter invented, with Wendy's help, a new game that fascinated them enormously. And then, suddenly he had no more interest in it. And, once that happened, they were done playing with those games. Besides the games and the chores and the flying, there was the fascination with the mermaid's lagoon. If you shut your eyes and are a lucky one, you may see at times a shapeless pool of lovely pale colors suspended in the darkness. Then, if you squeeze your eyes tighter, the pool begins to take shape, and the colors become so vivid that with another squeeze, they must go on fire. But just before they go on fire, you see the lagoon. This is the nearest you ever get to it on the mainland. Just one heavenly moment. If there could be two moments, you might see the surf and hear the mermaids singing. The children often spent long summer days on this lagoon, swimming or floating most of the time, playing the mermaid games in the water, and so forth. The most haunting time at which to see them is at the turn of the moon. Wendy had never seen the lagoon by moonlight, less from fear, for of course Peter would have accompanied her, than because she had strict rules about everyone being in bed by 7. She was often at the lagoon, however, on sunny days after rain, when the mermaids come up in extraordinary numbers to play with their bubbles. The bubbles of many colors made in rainbow water. They treat as balls, hitting them gaily from one to the other with their tails, and trying to keep them in the rainbow till they burst. The goals are at each end of the rainbow, and the keepers only are allowed to use their hands. Sometimes hundreds of mermaids will be playing in the lagoon at a time, and is quite a pretty sight. But the moment the children tried to join in, they had to play by themselves, for the mermaids immediately disappeared. Nevertheless, we have proof that they secretly watched the interlopers, and were not above taking an idea from them. For John introduced a new way of hitting the bubble, with the head instead of the hand. And the mermaid goalkeepers adopted it. This is the one mark that John has left on the Neverland. It must also have been rather pretty to see the children resting on a rock for half an hour after their midday meal. Wendy insisted on their doing this, and it had to be a real rest, even though the meal was make-believe. So they lay there in the sun, and their bodies glistened in it, while she sat beside them and looked important. And this is how their days continued in Neverland, playing make-believe and sharing adventures together. But now we must return to that desolate home from which 3 of our characters had taken heartless flight so long ago. It seems a shame to have neglected number 14 all this time, and yet we may be sure that Mrs. Darling doesn't blame us. If we had returned sooner to look with sorrowful sympathy at her, she would have probably cried, "Don't be silly. What do I matter? Go back and keep an eye on the children." So we venture into that familiar nursery only because its lawful occupants are on their way home. We are merely hurrying on in advance of when they return, to see that their beds are properly aired and that Mr. and Mrs. Darling do not go out for the evening. Why on earth should their beds be properly aired, seeing that they left them in such a thankless hurry? Would it not serve them jolly well right if they came back and found that their parents were spending the weekend in the country? Wouldn't it be the moral lesson they have been in need of since we met them? But if we contrive things in this way, Mrs. Darling would never forgive us. One thing I should like to do immensely, and that is to tell her in the way authors have that the children are coming back, that indeed they will be here on Thursday next week. This would spoil so completely the surprise to which Wendy and John and Michael are looking forward. They have been planning it out on the ship. Mother's rapture, father's shout of joy, Nana's leap through the air to embrace them first, when what they ought to be preparing for is a good hiding. How delicious to spoil it all by breaking the news in advance. But on this night, like the others, Mr. and Mrs. Darling eventually fell fast asleep, for they had no knowledge of what was to come next. In the meantime, Peter, Tinker Bell, Wendy, John, and Michael had begun their flight to return home. Once again, they were immersed in the magical experience of floating through the air, noticing the moon and the stars, flying through the clouds in a vast expanse of sky and beautiful silence, except for the time when one of them would call out with delight when seeing something beautiful, surprising, or extraordinary. Peter and Tinker Bell flew faster, and after what seemed to be a very long journey, they finally found the house, the open window, and simply flew into the nursery. Peter whispered to Tinker Bell, "Quick, Tink, close the window, bar it." "That's right. Now you and I must get away by the door, and when Wendy comes, she will think her mother has barred her out, and she'll have to go back with me." This trick had been in his head all the time. Instead of feeling that he was behaving badly, he danced with glee, and then he peeped in and saw that Mrs. Darling had laid her head down and that tears were sitting on her eyes. She wants me to unbar the window, thought Peter, but I won't, not I. He peeped again, and the tears were still there, or another two had taken their place. She's awfully fond of Wendy, he said to himself. He was angry with her now for not seeing why she could not have Wendy. The reason was so simple. I'm fond of her too. We can't both have her. But the lady would not make the best of it, and he was unhappy. He ceased to look at her, but even though she would not let go of him, he skipped about and made funny faces. And when he stopped, it was just as if she were inside him, knocking. Oh, all right, he said at last, and gulped, and then he unbarred the window. Come on, Tink, he cried with a frightful sneer at the laws of nature. Thus Wendy and John and Michael found the window open for them after all, which of course was more than they deserved. They alighted on the floor, quite unashamed of themselves, and the youngest one had already forgotten his home. John, he said, looking around him doubtfully, I think I've been here before. Of course you have, you silly. This is your old bed. Let's creep in, John suggested, and put our hands over our eyes. But Wendy, who saw that they must break the joyous news more gently, had a better plan. Let's all slip into our beds and be there when she comes back, just as if we've never been away. And so when Mrs. Darling went back to the night nursery to see if her husband was asleep, all the beds were occupied. The children waited for her cry of joy, but it did not come. She saw them, but she did not believe they were there. You see, she saw them in their beds so often in her dreams that she thought this was just the dream hanging around her still. She sat down in the chair by the fire, where in the old days she had nursed them. They could not understand this, and a cold fear fell upon all of the three children. Mother, Wendy cried. That's Wendy, she said, but still she was sure it was a dream. Mother, that's John, she said. Mother, cried Michael. He knew her now. That's Michael, she said, and she stretched out her arms for the three little selfish children. They went round John and Wendy and Michael, who had slipped out of bed and run to her. George, George, she cried when she could speak, and Mr. Darling woke to share her bliss, and Nana came rushing in. There could not have been a lovelier sight. But there was none to see except a strange boy who was staring in at the window. He had ecstasies innumerable that other children can never know. But he was looking through the window at the one joy from which he must be forever barred. So Peter saw Wendy once again before he flew away. Hello, Wendy. Goodbye, he said. Oh, dear, are you going away? Yes. You don't feel, Peter, she said falteringly, that you would like to say anything to my parents about a very sweet subject? No. About me, Peter? No. Mrs. Darling came to the window, for at present she was keeping a sharp eye on Wendy. She told Peter that she would like to adopt him. Would you send me to school? He inquired craftily. Yes. And then to an office? I suppose so. Soon I should be a man, very soon. I don't want to go to school and learn solemn things, he told her passionately. I don't want to be a man. And Mrs. Darling stretched out her arms to him. Keep back, lady. No one is going to catch me and make me a man. But where are you going to live? With Tink in the house we built for Wendy. The fairies are to put it high among the treetops where they sleep at night. How lovely, cried Wendy, so longingly that Mrs. Darling tightened her grip. I thought all the fairies were dead, Mrs. Darling said. There are always a lot of young ones, explained Wendy, who was now quite an authority. Because you see, when a new baby laughs for the first time, a new fairy is born. And as there are always new babies, there are always new fairies. They live in the nests on the top of the trees, and the mauve ones are boys, and the white ones are girls. I shall have such fun, said Peter, with one eye on Wendy. It will be rather lonely in the evening, she said, sitting by the fire. I shall have Tink. Tink called out from somewhere around the corner. It doesn't matter, Peter said. Oh, Peter, you know it matters. Well, then come with me to the little house. May I, Mummy? Certainly not. I've got you home again, and I mean to keep you. But he does so need a mother. So do you, my love. But Mrs. Darling saw his mouth twitch, and she made this handsome offer to let Wendy go to him for a week every year to do his spring cleaning. Wendy would have preferred a more permanent arrangement, and it seemed to her that spring would be long in coming. But this promise sent Peter away. He was happy. He had no sense of time and was so full of adventures that all I have told you about him is only a halfpenny worth of them. I suppose it was because Wendy knew this, that her last words to him were these rather plaintive ones. You won't forget me, Peter, will you, before spring cleaning time comes? Of course, Peter promised, and then he flew away. And he took Mrs. Darling's kiss with him. The kiss that had been for no one else, Peter took quite easily. It's sad to have to say that the power to fly gradually left all of them. At first, Nana tied their feet to the bedpost so that they should not fly away in the night. In time, they couldn't even fly after their hats. Want of practice, they called it, but it really meant was that they no longer believed. Michael believed longer than the other boys, though they jeered at him. So he was with Wendy when Peter came for her at the end of the first year. She flew away in the frock she had woven from the leaves and berries in the Neverland. He had so much to say about himself, and she looked forward to thrilling talks with him about old times. But new adventures had crowded the old ones from his mind. When she expressed a doubtful hope that Tinker Bell would be glad to see her, he said, "Who is Tinker Bell?" "Oh, Peter," she said, shocked. But even when she explained, he couldn't remember. "There are such a lot of them," he said. "I expect she is no more." I expect he was right, for fairies don't live long. They are so little that a short time seems a good while for them. Wendy was pained, too, to find that the past year was but as yesterday to Peter. It had seemed such a long year of waiting to her. But he was exactly as fascinating as ever, and they had a lovely spring cleaning in the little house on the treetops. Next year, he did not come for her. She waited in a new frock because the old one simply would not meet, but he never came. Perhaps he is ill, Michael said. You know he's never ill. Michael came close to her and whispered with a shiver. Perhaps there is no such person, Wendy. And then Wendy would have cried if Michael had not been crying. Peter came for the next spring cleaning, and the strange thing was that he never knew that he'd missed a year. That was the last time the girl Wendy ever saw him. For a little longer she tried for his sake not to have growing pains, and she felt she was untrue to him when she got a prize for general knowledge. But the years came and went without bringing the careless boy, and when they met again, Wendy was a married woman, and Peter was no more to her than a little dust in the box in which she had kept her toys. Wendy was grown up. You need not be sorry for her. She was one of the kind that likes to grow up. In the end, she grew up of her own free will, a day quicker than other girls. All the boys were grown up and done for by this time, so it's scarcely worth saying anything more about them. You may see the twins any day going to an office, each carrying a little bag and an umbrella. Michael is an engine driver, married a lady of title, and so he became a lord. The bearded man who doesn't know any story to tell his children was once John. Wendy was married in white with a pink sash. It's strange to think that Peter did not alight in the church and forbid the wedding. Years rolled on again, and Wendy had a daughter. This ought not to be written in ink, but in golden splash. She was called Jane, and always had an odd, inquiring look, as if from the moment she arrived on the mainland she wanted to ask questions. When she was old enough to ask them, they were mostly about Peter Pan. She loved to hear of Peter, and Wendy told her all she could remember in the very nursery from which the famous flight had taken place. It was Jane's nursery now, for her father had bought it from Wendy's father, who was no longer fond of stairs. Mrs. Darling had passed on. There were only 2 beds in the nursery now, Jane's and her nurse's, and there was no kennel, for Nana also had passed away. Once a week, Jane's nurse had her evening off, and then it was Wendy's part to put Jane to bed. That was the time for stories. It was Jane's invention to raise the sheet over her mother's head and her own, thus making a tent, and in the darkness to whisper, "What do we see now?" "I don't think I see anything tonight," says Wendy with a feeling that if Nana were here, she would object to further conversation. "Yes, you do," says Jane. "You see, when you were a little girl." "That's a long time ago, sweetheart," says Wendy. "Ah me, how time flies." "Does it fly?" asks the artful child. "The way you flew when you were a little girl?" "The way I flew? Do you know, Jane? I sometimes wonder whether I ever really did fly." "Yes, you did. The dear old days when I could fly." "Why can't you fly now, Mother?" "Because I am grown up, dearest. When people grow up, they forget the way." "Why do they forget the way?" "Because they are no longer innocent. It's only the innocent ones who can fly. I do wish I could. Wendy admitted that she does see something. I do believe, she says, that it is this nursery. I do believe it is, says Jane. Go on. So they embarked on the great adventure of the night when Peter flew in looking for his shadow. The foolish fellow, says Wendy, tried to stick it on with soap, and when he could not, he cried, and that woke me, and I sewed it on for him. You've missed a bit, interrupts Jane, who now knows the story better than her mother. When you saw him sitting on the floor crying, what did you say? I sat up in bed and I said, Boy, why are you crying? Yeah, that was it, says Jane with a big breath. And then he flew us all away to Neverland and the fairies and the mermaid's lagoon and the home under the ground and the little house. Which did you like best of all? I think I like the home under the ground best of all. Yes, so do I. What was the last thing Peter ever said to you? The last thing he ever said to me was, just always be waiting for me. And then some night you will hear me crowing. Yes. But alas, he forgot all about me, Wendy said with a smile. She was as grown up as that. What did his crow sound like? Jane asked one evening. It was like this, Wendy said, trying to imitate Peter's crow. No, it wasn't, Jane said gravely. It was like this, and she did it ever so much better than her mother. Wendy was a little startled. My darling, how can you know? I often hear it when I'm sleeping, Jane said. Ah, yes, many girls hear it when they're sleeping, but I was the only one who heard it awake. Lucky you, said Jane. And then one night came. It was the spring of the year, and the story had been told for the night, and Jane was now asleep in her bed. Wendy was sitting on the floor very close to the fire, so as to see to darn and sew, for there was no other light in the nursery. And while she sat darning, she heard a crow. Then the window blew open as of old, and Peter dropped on the floor. He was exactly the same as ever, and Wendy saw at once that he still had all his first teeth. He was a little boy. She was a grown-up. She huddled by the fire, not daring to move, helpless and guilty. A big woman. Hello, Wendy, he said, not noticing any difference, for he was thinking chiefly of himself. And in the dim light, her white dress might have been the nightgown in which he had seen her first. Hello, Peter, she replied faintly, squeezing herself as small as possible. Something inside her was crying. Woman, woman, let go of me. Hello, where is John? John isn't here now. Is Michael asleep, he asked with a careless glance at Jane. Yes, she answered, and now she felt that she was untrue to Jane as well as to Peter. That's not Michael, she said quickly, lest a judgment should fall on her. Peter looked. Hello, is it a new one? Yes. Boy or girl? Girl. Now surely he would understand, but not a bit of it. Peter, she said, faltering, are you expecting me to fly away with you? Of course, that's why I've come, he added a little sternly. Have you forgotten that this is spring cleaning time? She knew it was useless to say that he had let many spring cleaning times pass. I can't come, she said apologetically. I've forgotten how to fly. I'll soon teach you again. Oh, Peter, don't waste the fairy dust on me. She had risen, and now, at last, a fear assailed him. "What is it?" he cried, shrieking. "I will turn up the light," she said, "and then you can see for yourself." For almost the only time in his life that I know of, Peter was afraid. "Don't turn up the light," he cried. She let her hands play in the hair of the tragic boy. She was not a little girl heartbroken about him. She was a grown woman smiling at it all, but they were wet smiles. Then she turned up the light, and Peter saw. He gave a cry of pain, and when the tall, beautiful creature stooped to lift him in her arms, he drew back sharply. "What is it?" he cried again. She had to tell him. "I am old, Peter. I am ever so much more than 20. I grew up long ago." "You promised not to." "I couldn't help it. I'm a married woman, Peter." "No, you're not." "Yes, and the little girl in the bed is my baby." "No, she's not." But he supposed she was, and he took a step towards the sleeping child with his dagger. Of course he didn't strike. He sat down on the floor instead and sobbed. And Wendy did not know how to comfort him, though she could have done it so easily once upon a time. She was only a woman now, and she ran out of the room to try to think. Peter continued to cry, and soon his sobs woke Jane. She sat up in bed and was interested at once. "Boy," she said, "why are you crying?" Peter rose and bowed to her, and she bowed to him from the bed. "Hello," he said. "Hello," said Jane. "My name is Peter Pan," he told her. "Yes, I know. I came back from my mother," he explained, "to take her to the Neverland." "Yes, I know," Jane said. "I've been waiting for you." When Wendy returned, she found Peter sitting on the bed, crowing gloriously. Jane in her nightie was flying around the room in solemn ecstasy. "She is my mother," Peter explained, and Jane descended and stood by his side with the look on her face that he liked to see on ladies when they gazed at him. "He does so need a mother," Jane said. "Yes, I know." Wendy admitted rather forlornly, "No one knows it so well as I." "Goodbye," said Peter to Wendy, and he rose in the air, and the shameless Jane rose with him. It was already her easiest way of moving about. Wendy rushed to the window. "No, no," she cried. "It's just for spring cleaning time," Jane said. "He wants me always to do his spring cleaning." "If only I could go with you," Wendy sighed. "You see, you can't fly," said Jane. Of course, in the end, Wendy let them fly away together. Our last glimpse of her shows her at the window, watching them receding into the sky until they were as small as stars. As you look at Wendy, you may see her hair becoming white and her figure little again, for all this happened long ago. Jane is now a common grown-up with a daughter called Margaret, and every spring cleaning time, except when he forgets, Peter comes for Margaret and takes her to the Neverland, where she tells him stories about himself, to which he listens eagerly. When Margaret grows up, she'll have a daughter, who is to be Peter's mother in turn, and thus it will go on, so long as children are innocent. And that's the end of our story. And I wish you sweet dreams and good night.